Hi there, everybody. Hope you're having a great first day so far. We're so happy to have you here. I know being next to the bar is helpful, right? Thank you. I told him that you would give him wild rock star applause, so please don't let me down. And welcome to the stage from SendGrid, J.R. Jesperson. Come on up.
Good evening, everyone. Can you hear me all right? Good? All right. It's a little funky. I feel like I should be peddling ShamWow, the headphones. So, my name is JR. You are at Archeology Meets Architecture. So I see some of you have already dipped into libations. That's good. That'll make it easier for at least one of us. This talk is about our journey at SingGrid to optimize our approach to migrating to AWS. So let's get going. So a quick overview about what we'll be discussing today. I'll give you a little bit of context about myself and my company, where we're coming from. And then we'll get into the meat of it with the archaeology, kind of digging to make sure that the approach that you're taking with your migration is fit for purpose for what your company is trying to accomplish. Get a little bit into the methodology that drives from the architecture, and just follow up with some key takeaways. So first, a little bit about SingGrid. SingGrid's mission is to deliver customer communications that drive engagement and growth, and our vision is to become the world's most trusted communication platform. To that end, we deliver more than 30 billion emails to 1.7 billion unique email addresses a month. To put that into context, that's more than 2 times the tweets that occur in any given day. SingGrid also powers the customer communications for some of the world's most recognizable and innovative brands, shown here. We recently achieved advanced partner status on the AWS Partner Network, or APN, and we're also available on the marketplace. All right, enough about me. Let's get to work. So first, I want to talk about the archaeology, the digging. This is really easy step for you to miss when you're working on your migration to Amazon. Architecture is really about removing assumptions from the decision-making process. No technology or architecture is going to be perfect. They all convey both virtues and drawbacks. So if you take the time to really understand what does success look like, what problem are we trying to solve, what capability are we trying to create, this goes a long way in terms of constraining your future designs in architecture, saves a lot of time, and ensures that the work that you're engaging in is aligned with what your company is trying to accomplish. To do this, you need to look at it from multiple different angles, not just from the technology perspective as I would, but we engage with our colleagues in the business, in product, and InfoSec, and the like, to ensure that we understand what success looks like for each of these different groups. And this will likely lead to some mutually exclusive conclusions or drivers. We'll talk a little bit more about that here. So when you're working with a diverse set of key stakeholders, it's likely that you're going to end up with considerations that are at odds with one another, or at least mutually exclusive to some extent. So the approach that we found that was most helpful for this was to stack rank these drivers. This is more qualitative than quantitative. There's no way to mathematically apply an algorithm and understand that you're developing the exact perfect thing for what your company is trying to achieve. Even though the data is qualitative, though, it is better than nothing. Some data, better applied and well understood, is better than doing nothing at all. This, again, will ensure that the architectures from your migration are going to maximize what your business is trying to achieve. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit more about the assessment model in a few slides. But first, I'll start with an example of what the stack ranks might look like. So a couple things to note on this example. One is that each column in this particular model should add up to 100%. We sometimes joke about executives having the power of and, which is this notion of it needs to be fast and cheap and reliable and et cetera, et cetera. So my first pointer here would be to make sure that you try and hold to that as much as possible. Sometimes there are kind of showstoppers or must-haves. Try and limit those. Oftentimes, if you keep probing into that, you'll find out that that actually can be quantified to a certain extent. And it's a shame my CFO is not here tonight. I left a little nugget on here just for him, but we'll have to tell them about it. So once you have that done, the next thing is to develop an assessment model. The idea here is that this is not a one-dimensional or two-dimensional or even three-dimensional problem. With your business, it's likely that you're going to have multiple considerations, multiple vectors, and it's very difficult to try and understand, well, this is cheaper, this is faster, which approach should I take? This assessment model helps you achieve that. Another noteworthy bit about this is that this can create some inversions. So normally you think kind of bigger number, better, or more effective for your model. In some cases, that's not true. Things would be like risk exposure, cost. So in the next slide, I have an example that I show some of those inversions. The scores that these will yield help inform to some extent, both the priority of the migrations that you might do to AWS, might also define things that are just not worthwhile or a no-op, where the juice isn't worth the squeeze. And this is where you start to get a little bit of a sense for what the target state of your architecture should start to look like. So here's an example of an assessment model. In the third row, I've put inversion, where decreasing cycle time is what we're measuring there. So the idea here is for each given architecture for something that you want to migrate, you apply this score, and this allows you to quantitatively compare one solution against another. All right, so that the archaeology is really all about developing an ideology to help frame a mental framework for how you want to go about this process. The next step is where architecture comes in. This is where you're going to begin to design your solutions. So the AWS landing zone, kind of the first step that you're going to need to take if you don't have an AWS footprint already. This is pretty well covered ground, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. I'll just highlight a few things. The first thing is that AWS has developed the well-architected framework. If you haven't heard about it, or if you haven't been looking at that, I would strongly recommend that you do. It's pretty comprehensive. The AWS team will walk through it with you, and it really gives you the ability to consider things that might have not have been top of mind when you were in your solutions phase. The rest of these are fairly common sense, although I dropped them here because common sense is not always common practice. Finally, I want to highlight that measuring the latency turned out to be a very important fact for us. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later, but in this phase, it's critically important to determine which regions you're going to be in and establish what your connection methods are going to be, and start to get a sense and measure what your latency is. The methodology is really all about creating a repeatable process, and the idea of this is to minimize any sprawl that is unnecessary. So in our case, we tried to create a methodology that was as specific as it could be without being specific enough that it wouldn't apply to different parts of our infrastructure that we were migrating. Incremental value is something that we are striving for with our migration. Obviously, we all want to avoid big bang efforts, so we really have tried to prioritize and focus on the things that we can move to AWS that are going to really move the needle for us first. So here's an example of a methodology, and we can just talk through a little bit of this. In my experience with architecture, in particular, identifying the current state is one step that is frequently either skipped completely or not given enough weight as it should. In this phase, you can really uncover some of the assumptions, many of them implicit in the architecture. Things like the application is anticipating persistence at the compute or storage tiers. It might be latency sensitive, and that may have been something that has never manifested for you before. These are things that you need to consider. In the target states, you apply the assessment model that we talked about earlier, and this gives you the best that you can get in terms of a quantitative measure of how effective or how fit for purpose the architecture is. Again, that assessment model applies multiple dimensions, and so you're not pigeonholed into thinking about it just as an architect or just a technology person. You're considering the diverse opinions from the rest of your company. In our case, we made this a collaborative process, so it's entirely possible for a given bit of our infrastructure that we've had to come up with several target architectures. We apply the assessment model to those, we measure them, and we work with the product team to try and identify which one is going to be the best fit for us. There's many different ways that you can go about this. Finally, a question I get a lot is, should we do a lift and shift or should we do a cloud native? And that's really a false dichotomy. The answer is, of course, it depends. Each bit of your infrastructure is going to be different. It's going to convey different pros and cons. And again, with the assessment model, that starts to make it clear where you may identify some things that simply can just be moved without any further ado. Some things are going to need to be refactored significantly to a more cloud native posture. So an example of that would be a stateful bursty workload. As an example, let's say you are an email company and you have stateful MTAs that have to hold mail for retries for days at a time. That's not a very good fit for a cloud bursting scenario. Right? If we need the capacity for 5 minutes and then I need to leave those EC2 instances up for 7 days, that doesn't make a lot of sense. So that's a good example where a lift and shift is almost a non-starter. Data entanglement, I've referenced this twice earlier in the presentation in terms of measuring the latency. Specifically, in your architecture, you may find that you have kind of a dog pile at the data architecture tier. So this is multiple applications or multiple components of your system all relying on the same data store. This is pretty common for startups, for high growth companies. It's eases the development process. You kind of offload the business logic of doing joins to the data tier. If you have multiple applications that are write latency sensitive and they're all using the same database, you're going to have to tease those things apart before, or you're going to need to move them all at the same time, which looks a little bit more like a Big Bang type approach. So the takeaways that I just wanted to underscore for this talk: don't sell yourself short on developing an ideology. This really is answering the question of what success looks like for your company, and it ensures that the architectures that you produce are fit for purpose. The assessment model is a way that we use to enable us to quantitatively compare otherwise qualitative measures. It enabled us to compare different target architectures. It enabled us to help understand prioritization of the stuff that we're in the process of migrating up to Amazon. And finally, don't pigeonhole yourself into just a lift and shift or rewrite everything cloud native. Again, the assessment model helps a bit with understanding where the juice is worth the squeeze, and if the target architecture necessitates that you need to re-architect for cloud native, it just really helps elucidate that decision. So I think that's it for me. I've got a few minutes for questions if anybody has any.
And I'd happily bring you the microphone if anyone has a question.
No questions?
I think you answered them all.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for coming out. Have a good evening.
Thank you, JR.